In Book 10 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, there's three passages that describe the incestuous relationship between King Cinyras and his daughter Myrrh that produces the famous child Adonis, who is loved by both immortal goddesses Venus and Persephone. In the myth, the daughter Myrrh falls in love with her father, King Cinyras, and one night, with the help of her nurse, she goes into his bed, and it results in her getting pregnant. And it's not just one night; they couple for many nights. And one of the nights, though, it's discovered that she is the king's daughter, and at once he turns hostile against her, chasing her around with his sword, because he's intent right on killing her out of shame of the sin. And she escapes and is turned into a tree, with her blood becoming myrrh sap, and eventually she gives birth to Adonis, who himself is in the form of a young sapling tree. And these three passages from Metamorphoses are interesting in many ways, really, but but for the sake of the breadth of this video, I'm just going to link the birth of Adonis as written in Book 10 of Ovid's Metamorphoses along with Book 9 of the Iliad as told in a monologue given by Phoenix, where Phoenix is a veteran soldier and king himself, but most importantly to the story, he's like the adopted father, or maybe a better title would be the mentor of Achilles. And he watched Achilles as a baby and taught him how to fight and accompanied him to Troy too. So Phoenix tells the story of Adonis' birth, I interpret, through the text of his monologue in Book 9 of the Iliad. But he also tells the story of Achilles, I argue, too. I mean, the language or grammar is vague on purpose in the Iliad sometimes, and that depending how you read the passage, how much context you're allowing yourself to interpret the text with, you could take away that Phoenix is like the father of Achilles, or maybe they're like kind of similar figures. Another way we can look at it is that Phoenix is like the mythological bird. The phoenix, which of course after it dies, it's reborn from the ashes of the previous life. And according to Apollodorus, there are claims that this phoenix mythological creature was the father of Adonis, and it would make sense that they're both these dying and rising gods, whereas Phoenix rises in the form of the bird. It's Adonis who rises again in the form of a rose or a red flower. So here, I'll read from Wikipedia about Phoenix. It's pretty interesting. The phoenix is a long-lived bird associated with Greek mythology, with analogs in many cultures that cyclically regenerates or is otherwise born again. Associated with the sun, a phoenix obtains new life by arising from the ashes of its predecessor. Some legends say it dies in a show of flames and combustions, other that it simply dies and decomposes before being born again. The origin of the phoenix has been attributed to ancient Egypt by Herodotus and later 19th century scholars, but other scholars think the Egyptian text may have been influenced by classical folklore. Over time, the phoenix motif spread and gained variety of new associations. Herodotus, Lucan, Pliny the Elder, Pope Clement, Ovid, and Isidore of Seville are among those who have contributed to the retelling and transmission of the phoenix motif. Over time, extending beyond its origins, the phoenix could variously symbolize renewal in general, as well as the sun, time, the empire, metempsychosis, consecration, resurrection, life in the heavenly paradise, Christ, Mary, virginity, the exceptional man, and certain aspects of Christian life. Some scholars have claimed that the poem De Ave Finis may represent the mythological phoenix motif as a symbol of Christ's resurrection. Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I think hopefully through the video we'll kind of cover like all those, because I think this is kind of well said. So the phoenix motif is one that has possible origins in Egypt, which is interesting both in the case of the Iliad, but also comparing to the book of Exodus, which takes place in Egypt. And if we can understand or interpret the Iliad as kind of like this older Cretan Minoan religion, or maybe it's like a Mycenaean adaptation of this older Minoan mythos, then the question has to be asked, like, how did the Minoans come about their religion? Because the Minoan religion is like the Near East mythos, and I guess kind of like the Egyptian religion too, but it shares a lot of similarities with like the poems of Enki, Dumazed, and Gilgamesh, and Inanna, and that's how we can see it in the later, Homeric versions of this mythos. And one explanation could be that the religion could have come from Egypt and made its way to both Crete as well as the Near East. And then by the end of the Bronze Age, you're circling back and making its way to Greece and Egypt again after the collapse, because there seems to be multiple accounts of the Adonis and Phoenix motif, where some claim its origin in Syria, Arabia, but others Egypt. And there's archaeological links between Egypt, Arabia, the Sinai, and Sumer during the Bronze Age in late Neolithic, right? Just look at a map and you'll see that there would have been a logical nexus point there, right? The Sinai Peninsula was where you would get from Eurasia to North Africa. Furthermore, archaeologists have found pyramid structures built in the 4th and 3rd millennium BC, both in Egypt and Sumer, and where the ziggurats are built in Sumer and pyramids in Egypt. And they're built a couple thousand years before the Bronze Age collapse. It's like us looking back at the fall of the Roman Empire, or going in looking at the ruin of the Colosseum in Rome. This is how the classical age Greeks would have looked at the Egyptian pyramids. And because like in Sumer, the White Temple of Uruk which is dedicated to the worship of the sky god An, was built in the 4th millennium BC, and all the pyramids of Egypt were built in a short span of time during the Old Kingdom of the 3rd millennium BC. And during the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian rulers were they resemble these god kings, which is probably where you get this shape for the pyramid, this symbolic representation of this hierarchical ruling dynamic. The term pharaoh was projected onto older kings of Egypt, where the title of pharaoh wasn't proper terminology until the late Bronze Age. So they didn't call themselves pharaohs when they were building the pyramids. It was only later in the 13th century BC, around 1200 BCE, that they started using pharaoh. But now we just use it for all the ages. But that's kind of how it works, right? English is this composite language where that borrows and it projects backwards into history, right? And the PH or phi sound we use even today in English, French, Italian, comes from the Greek language, but it originally comes from the Phoenician alphabet, which is derived from Egypt. The PH is this Canaanite or Phoenician way of symbolically saying the phi, or whatever hieroglyph that was associated with that vocalization or letter. And it is eventually adapted into Greece as it's spread by possibly Phoenician merchants, or maybe it comes directly from Egypt by way of trade with Crete, and then Mycenaean Greece, along with contact with Asia Minor and the Levant as well during the later Bronze Age. It would lead much credence to the historicity of the Pharaoh and Moses, and likewise linking Achilles to this Pharaoh character, where we can understand the Eleusinian mysteries, the Iliad, and even the Hebrew religion as partially derivative of this earlier Egyptian religion and culture, where the aspect of a life after death are prevalent themes in the Egyptian and Christian religion. And I wish I could say I knew more about the Egyptian religion, but unfortunately it's not as well attested as the Sumerian tradition of Gilgamesh and the host of other epic myths that have survived these thousands of years. Whereas the hieroglyphic way of writing doesn't lend itself well to myth writing or any type of long form way of capturing tales and narratives. And it wasn't until the Greeks of the early Iron Age that an alphabet was created where such an arduous task could be done, and all these words compiled into written form. Just imagine trying to write the Iliad in hieroglyphs. The library would just have to be massive, housing all these books. And that's why the Egyptian leaders themselves would correspond in the Semitic Akkadian cuneiform, as well as other leaders of the Near East and Mediterranean of the late Bronze Age, right? The Hittites had their own language, but the leaders in palace court would correspond in Semitic Akkadian, or possibly another language, similar to how the Norman leaders of medieval England who spoke this French or older French while simultaneously ruling this like English-speaking public. So I think the Iliad is kind of a mix of the older Egyptian religion and rites, but like Exodus, this new religion is formed of the monotheistic Yahweh, which we can understand as like this composite god that takes the form of Saturn. Because at the beginning of the Iliad, Apollo and Jove are the two main gods I interpret, and by the end we have like every god fighting in the mix, and Vulcan has kind of arguably become the most powerful god at the end of the Iliad, and the Iliad in late Bronze Age ends in this winter, where Dionysus becomes like this ascendant god too as well, and all the heroes are burned in these funeral pyres of Vulcan, and you have this kind of like proto-Judaic or proto-Christian religion forming. And moreover, the historical relevance or reality of the Iliad can be confirmed as well, where we can link the burial rites of those in ancient Anatolia with those found in Homer, right? Which makes sense given the setting of the epic and of Troy, right? But also the fact that Homer himself was Ionian. And you add that to the fact that the Egyptians and later Israelites didn't practice cremation of their dead, but rather burial. The same can be said for Minoan and Mycenaean Greece too, and it wasn't until around 1200 BC that cremation or the funeral pyres became more popular among the religious rites of the recently deceased. And here, so I'll read. And once again, I'll read from Wikipedia. In the Middle East and Europe, both burial and cremation are evident in the archaeological record in the Neolithic era. Cultural groups had their own preferences and prohibitions. The ancient Egyptians developed an intricate transmigration of soul theology which prohibited cremation. This was also widely adopted by Semitic peoples. The Babylonians, according to Herodotus, embalmed their dead. Early Persians practiced cremation, but this was forbidden during the Zoroastrian period. Phoenicians both practiced both cremation and burial. From the Cyclic civilization in 3000 BCE until the sub-Mycenaean era in 1200 to around 1100 BCE, Greeks practiced burial. Cremation appeared around the 12th century BCE, probably influenced by Anatolia, and until the Christian era when inhumation became the only burial practice. Both combustion and inhumation again had been practiced depending on the era and location. Romans practiced both with cremation, the rule until later imperial period. Citation needed. Okay. Citation needed. In Europe, there are traces of cremation dating to the early Bronze Age, circa 2000 BCE in the Pannonian Plain and along the middle Danube. The customs became dominant throughout Bronze Age Europe with the Urnfield culture from circa 1300 BC, and the Iron Age inhumation again becomes more common, but cremation persisted in the Villanovan culture and elsewhere. Homer's account of Patroclus' burial describes cremation with the subsequent burials in a tumulus, similar to Urnfield burials and qualifying as the earliest description of cremation rites. This may be an anachronism, as during the Mycenaean times, burial was generally preferred, and Homer may have been reflecting the more common use of cremation at the time the Iliad was written, centuries later. So again, it seems the Iliad and Exodus are a mix of cultures and mythos of the Near East and Mediterranean of the time. And it's what you expect. Today, like if you speak English, you speak a composite language that borrows from the past and it uses its own words when available or better suited. Any language in myth base is kind of going to be a composite, I would argue, and it's going to borrow and build off others. We haven't not lived in a global world for probably 5,000 to 6,000 years, right? Humans have always been social animals, and at one point maybe there was kind of like this one language that was like written about in the tale of the Tower of Babel. Things are a lot more connected than we might think they are, I think. Additionally, in the Iliad, we have more links to both the Proto-Judaic ideology along with the Eleusinian mysteries described in the Homeric tradition, where we can equate the story of Passover and the unleavened bread to the Eleusinian festivals famous from classical Greece. where the Eleusinian Mysteries were a 9 or 10-day long festival, starting traditionally on the 14th or 15th day of the month, and ending on the 24th, marking the beginning of the spring harvest. So it wasn't the 14th and 15th of every month. It's the 14th or the 15th day of the month, marking the beginning of the spring harvest. So it was dedicated to the harvest god Demeter, involving the eating of white barley, offering of the first fruits, but most importantly, the rules and offerings were kind of laid out in this mythological form for ceremonial and political purposes, right? A lot of things, yes, there's this esoteric meaning, but also it's just kind of like meat and potatoes of the religion, right? That relates to the clergy and scribes and other everyday functions to keep the religion going, right? It's like nuts and bolts, and that's kind of what Exodus 12 is. And this brings me to the story of Myrrh and Cinyras, where I argue you can connect Exodus and the Eleusinian Mysteries, where the father, King Cinyras, has an incestuous relationship with his daughter Myrrh, while the mother is away at the festival for Demeter, right? This Eleusinian Mysteries. And in Exodus 12, we have a description of the Passover festival, and then the last plague of the firstborn child, where I think we can think of Achilles as the first child, right? That he's going to be killed by Yahweh, because Apollodorus tells of the prophecy where Jove hears the son of Thetis will be stronger than himself, right? Jupiter. And because initially Jove and Poseidon wanted to marry Thetis, but then they heard about this prophecy of the stronger son, so then they let Peleus, a mortal man, marry Thetis. And I think the story of Cinyras and Myrrh, told by Ovid, is related to the Iliad, but also Exodus, in the obvious way, in that it's stated that the mother of Myrrh and the wife of Cinyras is away at the Eleusinian Mysteries festival, while the husband is at home. So another way we can look at this is like through the supposed tradition of the Egyptians and Pharaoh's way of coupling through incest, right, as a way of continuing the family line and like keeping it pure or blue-blooded, so to speak. While it's not totally known how prevalent or how long this practice was used, but there are genetic and scientific finds and research that has concluded that it's true, where figures such as King Tut were born of this brother-sister incestuous relationship. So perhaps this Eleusinian Mysteries was like this coming of age for young women to be bred or at least impregnated by priests or high-ranking members of the palace court. Maybe that's what's meant by the first fruit, right? This firstborn sons or daughters of high-ranking families are priests, who are then mated with like these family members of the general populace or maybe even lower courts. So this could be like, the history of civilization itself, where the Neolithic communal life of like this incestuous pharaoh, king or god king ruling class is supplanted by the industrious, urban, and capitalistic Bronze Age. And this old tribal way of mating within the family and in general kingship is supplanted, right, by this revolutionary Moses and his confederation of Hebrews. And the same for Troy, where this kingship is overthrown by united Greek nations who sail under the banner of Agamemnon, this Pluto-like figure. If we think of Pharaoh from Exodus and Achilles as the same figures, we can link them to Adonis, or the incestuous child of Cinyras and Myrrh, who make love during the Eleusinian Mysteries. So perhaps Achilles and Adonis, again, are like this firstborn child of Pharaoh, who is killed by Yahweh, where Achilles is destined to be killed by Jove in the Iliad, and Adonis killed by a boar. Furthermore, Moses in Exodus asked the Pharaoh to let his people go out of Egypt. And then they celebrate the Passover, where they don't eat leavened bread for like a week, or bread prepared with yeast. And they stockpile the bread for the journey ahead. Then, right, they like supply up. And this Passover is, again, like the Eleusinian Mysteries festival, in that they save the yeast to make this wine drink, and that's served with the barley, right? And it's like the unleavened bread in the Hebrew mythos. And so those nights that Cinyras is laying with his daughter Myrrh are perhaps nights mentioned in Exodus 12, right? where they're laying out the Passover holiday rites essentially, right? Maybe there is some truth to Exodus, and we're getting like both sides of the story. And the Hebrews are kind of like this priest class that fell out of favor with the Pharaoh and were forced to leave, right? And it's interesting, this is essentially what happened during like the Bronze Age, right? Egypt kind of was like the only civilization to survive, and there's like this theory, right, of the sea people or whatever. But Egypt was the only civilization really to make it out and into the early Iron Age intact. Maybe a better way to understand the Eleusinian mysteries, though, is like a holiday or time off work in a capitalist society, right? You can't work people to death, even even in the Bronze Age. That's not a sustainable practice. And that's essentially what's laid out in the role of the Sabbath, right? Is resting your slaves for a day, so they can get back to their toils the next 6 days. And we might be able to think of the Iliad or the Eleusinian Mysteries as like a slave hymn, or like this the song that's cataloging the various industries at work in this Bronze Age world. Like similar today, that when you work, you kind of listen to music too. And and the industries are going to be mining, farming, soldiering, smithing, priesthood, and of course like the select few aristocracies. Whether the Hebrews were a slave class or maybe somewhere in between, like a priestly or merchant class, is unknown. But I would say there's probably some truth to Exodus, just due to how the Bronze Age ended and kind of like the archaeological evidence of what we know about it. Moreover, we see this incestuous relationship in Near East mythologies of Babylon and Sumer, along with the Greek and Roman pantheon, right? Until a certain extent, where in the case of the Iliad, we have the Age of Heroes, right? Where the focus is on mortal men, and they exist in a time right after Heracles and the demigods, and way after the time of like these immortal gods. So although they are still able to like interact with the immortal gods, and in some cases couple with them, right, which is the case of Achilles and his father Peleus and the mother Thetis. But this motif of mortals being loved by a mortal woman we can associate with Adonis, right, in this kind of time of the Bronze Age, where the mortal men, specifically probably like soldiers, can kind of rise in fame. Perhaps this is the incestuous and tribal-like nature of the late Neolithic making way for a larger economy and society of the Bronze Age that is spurred on by the breeding of peasants and royals, where there might have been a time where the royal palace and the aristocracy were the ones reproducing at greater numbers, until eventually technological and scientific advancements allowed for the economic system to grow due to the increased surplus of goods like food, thus facilitating a growth in the birth rate of the rich, but also the working class, and that the rich kind of became the working class. And once again, I see these myths as like these Bronze Age or Iron Age hymns for like this feudal or slave-like society of farming, soldiering, mining, and other labors. And Vulcan is an ascendant god in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, as the name kind of suggests. As iron becomes more readily available, more soldiers become available, better tools for farming, better scientific instruments are now used. And in general, just the labor racket or labor market becomes larger. And this is controlled by this fire god Vulcan. And in Exodus, we see the rules for managing this slave class. So it's debatable if the Hebrews that are the slaves, if it's the Hebrews that are the slaves or not, right? Maybe they're the ones overseeing the construction of buildings in Egypt for the pharaoh in managing this kind of market or labor. And it's interesting that both Hebrews and Egyptians don't cremate their bodies, which is kind of what's described in the Iliad with these huge funeral pyres. But I think there's kind of these metaphors for the mummification process in pyramid culture that still kind of remains in the mythos, right? The burial and preservation of the body, and this kind of monument that's building after, which you can come back and worship in a solar year, right? To worship, but also kind of to mourn the dead, right? In addition, there's also these links to embalming and preservation of people with the essence or oil of myrrh, this kind of gum or resin-like material, can be linked to embalming fluid of today, right? We know today that was used for embalming. So once again, maybe the Eleusinian Mysteries is readapted from an older mythos describing the rites of Egypt, and in particular this mummification and preservation of the bodies. And the genetic line of Achilles itself is like this repeating process, where his grandfather Aeacus, his father Peleus, and then Achilles all follow the same life cycle. And it's his father Peleus who's this mortal man, right, who mates with the immortal goddess Thetis and produces the son, the quasi-immortal being Achilles. And Achilles is kind of immortal, right, except for his heel of his foot. And I think Richard mentioned this in his recent show with Mark, and that we will kind of reach this wall with IQ, and this is especially true, right? if you follow this Egyptian incestuous kind of relationship or way of kind of interbreeding. And this is something we see in the Arthurian legend with incest and this theme of famine. The incestuous relationship of Arthur and Morgana leads to the birth of the child Mordred, resulting in the degradation, right? This drought and famine of Camelot and England whole. So, right, Achilles and his family line is kind of analogous to Arthur and his story. And this repeating process is like this inescapable wall of IQ and just genetics, right? Your fate and destiny are kind of predetermined in a sense, regardless of the entropic forces of, your life, the random events that could happen. From Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, Book 3, Chapter 12, Section 6, the Sopus River was the son of Ocean and Tethys, or as Acusalis says, of Pero and Poseidon, or according to some, Zeus and Eurynome. Him, Metope, herself a daughter of the river Ladon, married and bore 2 sons, Ismenus and Pelagon, and 20 daughters, of whom one, Aegina, was carried off by Zeus. In search of her, Aesopus came to Corinth and learned from Sisyphus that the ravisher was Zeus. Aesopus pursued him, but Zeus, by hurling thunderbolts, sent him away back to his own streams. Hence calls are far-fetched to this day from the streams of that river, and having conveyed Aegina to the island, then named Oninane, but now called Aegina, after her. Zeus cohabited with her and begot a son Aeacus on her. As Aeacus was alone in the island, Zeus made the ants into men for him, and Aeacus married Andaeus, daughter of Sciron, by whom he had 2 sons, Peleus and Telamon. But Pherecydes says that Telamon was a friend, not a brother of Peleus. Now Aeacus was the most pious of men. Therefore, when Greece suffered from his infertility on account of Pelops, because in a war with Stymphалus, king of the Arcadians, being unable to conquer Arcadia, he slew the king under a pretense of friendship and scattered his mangled limbs. Oracles of the gods declared that Greece would be rid of its present calamities if Aeacus would offer prayers on its behalf. So Aeacus did offer prayers, and Greece was delivered from the dearth. Even after his death, Aeacus is honored in the abode of Pluto and keeps the keys to Hades. So from reading that, it's going back to the legend of Arthur. We can say maybe that Stymphалus is like Sir Lancelot, and Aeacus is like King Arthur, right? And that through friendship, he kind of betrays this Stymphалus character, and afterwards there's this famine and infertility in the land. Also, the line of Achilles features the theme of hiding a sword, right? This hiding a sword, and then the sword being used to draw out and identify the true heir of the line, which is Excalibur and the theme of Arthur. In addition, the Lady of the Lake we can assume to be Thetis, right? This mother of Achilles, who is a Nereid, a sea nymph of sort, right? And reading further into Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, when Thetis had got a babe by Peleus, she wished to make him immortal, and unknown to Peleus, she used to hide it in the fire by night in order to destroy the mortal element which the child inherited from its father, but by day she anointed him with ambrosia. But Peleus watched her, and seeing the child writhing on the fire, he cried out, and Thetis, thus prevented from accomplishing her purpose, forsook her infant son and departed to the Nereids. Peleus brought the child to Chiron, who received and fed him on the inwards of lions and wild swine and the marrows of bears, and named him Achilles, because he had not put his lips to the breast. But before that time his name was Ligurion. So Thetis wishes to make Achilles immortal, as he's born from a mortal father. Therefore she burns him in this fire. And maybe we can think of this as like some anxiety or embarrassment. The child is illegitimate or won't have the same opportunity or access as her, because she's an immortal goddess, and then she had to she had to mate or couple with a mortal, and she has kind of like this half-breed child. And again, think of this through capitalism. Perhaps Achilles is like he's this new pharaoh, and he might not be perceived to be legitimate, or he's kind of like this illegitimate ruler possibly, and his claim is not so solid. And the process of purification or burning is symbolic for kind of attaching him to this Vulcan cult, and it's a way for him to gain legitimacy in the world. So let's switch now and read from Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 10, lines 298 to 355 specifically. So Orpheus sings Myrrh's incestuous love for Cinyras. Cinyras was the son of Paphos, and he might have been counted among the fortunate if he, in turn, had been childless. I speak of terrible things. Fathers and daughters, keep away. Or if your mind takes pleasure in my song, put no faith in this story of mine, and imagine it did not happen. Or if you do believe in the punishment also that it brought. If nature, however, allows such crimes to be visible, then I gave thanks to the people of Thrace. This city and this land are far from the regions where such sin is born. Let the land of Panchaea, beyond Arabia, produce its balsam, cinnamon, customary, its incense, exuded from the trees, its flowers different from ours. It produces myrrh. A strange tree is not worth such a price. And from Wikipedia, this Panchaea is an island first mentioned by ancient Greek philosopher Euhemerus in the late 4th century BC. Euhemerus describes this place as home to a society made up of a number of different ethnic tribes, and is tripped there in his major work, Sacred History, only fragments of which survive. Fragments preserved by followers such as the later Greek historian Diodorus Siculus and 4th century AD Christian writer Eusebius of Caesarea describe Panchaea as a rational island paradise located in the Indian Ocean. Euhemerus went there by traveling through the Red Sea and around the Arabian Peninsula. In the island's temple of Zeus Tripophilius, he discovered a register of the births and deaths of the gods, proving they were merely historical figures. The island is also mentioned by Ligodamus, one of the Tibulan elegists, as a rich place from which hope for gifts to his grave. Virgil called the island incense-bearing, rich with sands. So perhaps maybe these historians' travels and historical works were used as kind of like the source material for the writing of the Jewish myth in the early Iron Age, right? Because Moses seems to have followed the same track as Euhemerus through the Red Sea to reach kind of these trade routes of around the Arabian Peninsula into the Near East and Indian Ocean. Specifically, it says that the idea of incest was born in the island of Panchaea, which is beyond the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean. And honestly, it kind of sounds like the Sumerian poem Enki and Innersog, where there's a place kind of like this mythological paradise or Garden of Eden called Dilmun. But Dilmun was actual place that was founded by Sargon of Akkad in the Arabian Peninsula and used as this like trading outpost. So perhaps this is what we're talking about. and from Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, he talks about the birth of Adonis as coming from Syria or the Assyrian Empire, which probably could have been true coming, around the time of the late Bronze Age collapse, that this mythos came into the East or the Western. So my theory is that during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, there was trade and other cultural links between Egypt, Sumer, and other civilizations. Then, of course, there's like these cycles within cycles. So the Bronze Age is broken up into multiple parts, and it's kind of discontinuous where empires fall and rise over this kind of 2,000-year period. So this cremation and the tale of Achilles is introduced through Anatolia or perhaps Phoenicia into Greece. But in general, the direction of east to west is what we see in the Iliad and afterwards, right? So before the Trojan War, the western Mycenaeans of Greece were in contact with, to south Egypt and then to the east Anatolia. And then afterwards, during the Archaic Iron Age, there was this kind of mass movement of people from east to west after the collapse of many of these kind of civilizations in the Near East and Mediterranean. Reading further from Ovid, Cupid denies that his arrows hurt you, Myrrha, and clears his fires of blame for your crime. One of the three sisters, the Furies, with her swollen snakes and firebrand from the Styx, breathe on you. It is wrong to hate your father, but that love was a greater wrong than hatred. The pick of the princes from everywhere desire you. Young men from the whole of the East come to win you in marriage. Out of the many, choose one for your husband, Myrrha, but let one man not be amongst the many. So it seems like here's a pretty clear reference to the birth of Venus, with the Furies present and breathing like the wind. And Paphos, the king Cinyras, means foam, like the foam that was in the sea during the birth of Venus, right? That's after the castration of the god Uranus. And of course, Cupid is the child of Venus. So I think here's a reference. This passage before I just read is a reference to Venus. And going further, indeed, she knows it and fights against her disgraceful. Indeed, she knows it and fights against her disgraceful passion, and says to herself, "Where is my thought leading? What am I creating? You gods, I pray, and the duty and sacred laws respecting parents prevent this wickedness and oppose my sin. Indeed, if sin it is. Yet they say there are races where mother and son and father and daughter pair off, and affection is increased by a double bond. Alas for me, that I did not happen to be born there, and that I am made to suffer by an accident of place. Why do I repeat these things? Forbidden hopes vanish. He is worth loving, but only as a father. I could lie with Cinyras, but if I were not Cinyras already, now he is not mine. Because he is already mine, and the nearness of our relationship damns me. I would be better off as a stranger. I would be happy to go far away and leave the borders of my homeland behind me, if I might run from evil, but even if nothing more is permitted, a wicked desire to see." So, in the passage where it says, the races where mother and son and father and daughter pair off, could be a reference to the Egyptians and the incestuous relationships of some of their kings and queens, but it could also be a metaphor of this kind of incestuous relationship of all these religions, right? The Greek gods, the Sumerian gods, Babylonian gods, and I'm sure the Egyptians. I just don't know much about their religious tradition, but the incest is more a metaphor for the power dynamics of the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, where at first the gods are very interbred, right? And the power lies just in the palace court with a few people. But by the end of the Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, the gods are kind of interacting with the mortals, right? And they're creating these demigods, and even mortals are becoming famous and becoming the main characters of the story, right? Gaining fame in battle, like Achilles during the Iliad. And likewise in Exodus, we see this kind of revolutionary figure in Moses, who is backed by Yahweh, right? He's this mortal figure, but he's also interacts with the gods, but he's the central focus, right? It's not the gods that are out there doing all the work. And thus, as a result, and we can link Yahweh as kind of similar to this Roman or Greek god of fire, this Vulcan, and that the fire or the flame is worshipped on the Sabbath, right? This day of rest where the fire is extinguished and the slaves don't have to work. And perhaps Moses was a slave, or Maybe he was kind of like this pseudo-revolutionary that is brought in by the centralized powers, right, and money behind the labor rackets of this slave system in ancient Egypt. And he's brought in to kind of ease some of the anxieties and tensions between the Egyptians and the slaves, or maybe the middleman, right, the Hebrews, right? So they're there to kind of round the edges and smooth any tensions or flare-ups as kind of like a controlled opposition, or like these pseudo-revolutionaries who are kind of there to lead people into what seems like a kind of revolutionary process, but it's really just kind of a waste of energy or a diversion. Or maybe Moses is kind of like this mixed child between the Egyptian pharaoh and this Hebrew midwife, right? And the child is kind of sent off. And then he ends up kind of being like this manager of the working class and the labor rackets of the Bronze Age. And he's kind of overseeing the construction of huge public works or monuments and architecture we know from ancient Egypt today. And eventually growing powerful enough to rival the pharaoh, right? The pharaoh, and he's eventually forced out to the Levant. Further from Book 10 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, the married women were celebrating the annual festival of Demeter when, their bodies veiled in white robes, they offer the first fruits of the harvest, wreaths of corn, and for 9 nights treat sexual union and the touch of men as forbidden. The king's wife was among the crowd, frequenting the sacred rites. And then reading further, now she could scarcely bear the weight of her womb. Tired of living and scared of dying, not knowing what to pray for, she composed these words of entreaty. Oh, if there are any gods who hear my prayer, I do not plead against my well-deserved punishment, but lest by being I offend the living, or by dying offend the dead, banish me from both realms and change me, and deny me life and death. Some god listened to her prayer, certainly. The last request found its path to the heavens. While she was still speaking, the soil covered her shins. Roots, breaking from her toes, spread sideways, supporting a tall trunk. Her bones strengthened, and in the midst of the remaining marrow, the blood became sap. Her arms became long branches, her fingers twigs, her skins solid bark. And now the growing tree had drawn together over her ponderous belly, buried her breast, and was beginning to encase her neck. She could not bear the weight, and she sunk down against the wood to meet it and plunged her face into the bark. Though she has lost her former senses with her body, she still weeps, and the warm drops trickle down the tree. There is merit also in the tears, and the myrrh that drips from the bark keeps its mistress' name, and about it no age will be silent. So the myrrh sap is known since the ancient times to have both medicinal and recreational uses as a drug, but it's also used as a perfume or incense for religious purposes, along with kind of its most interesting use in Egypt during the classical times as kind of an embalming fluid, right? It's used to mummify the dead. So let's read from Wikipedia. Myrrh resin has been used throughout history as a perfume, incense, and medicine. Myrrh mixed with posca or wine was common across ancient cultures for general pleasure and as a pain reliever. The 5th dynasty ruler of Egypt recorded the earliest attested expedition to the land of Punt, modern-day Horn of Africa, particularly Somalia, which brought back large quantities of myrrh, frankincense, malachite, and electrum. Other products that were also brought back included wild animals, particularly cheetahs, the secretary bird, giraffes, and hamadryas baboons, ebony, ivory, and animal skins. And so Hurry is shown celebrating this success of his venture in a relief from his mortuary temple, which shows him tending a myrrh tree in the garden of his palace named So Her Splendor Soars Up to Heaven. This relief is the only one in Egyptian art depicting a king gardening. Myrrh was used by the ancient Egyptians along with natron for the embalming of mummies. So perhaps this myth of the death and birth of a child, like that of the phoenix, is a metaphor for the religious ceremony and preservation involved with the mummification of the dead in ancient Egypt. And then reading further from Book 10 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, Orpheus sings Venus and Adonis. The child, conceived in sin, had grown within the tree and was now searching for a way to leave the mother and reveal itself. The pregnant womb swells within the tree trunk, the burden stretching the mother. The pain cannot form words, nor can Lucina be called upon in the voice of a woman in labor. Nevertheless, the tree bends like one straining and groaning constantly and is wet with falling tears. Gentle Lucina stood by the suffering branches, and laid her hands on them, speaking words that aid childbirth. At this the tree split open, and from the torn bark gave up its living burden. And the child cried. The Naiads laid him on the soft grass, and anointed him with mother's tears. Even envy would praise his beauty, being so like those of torsos of naked Amor painted on boards. But to stop them suffering in attributes, you must add a light quiver for him, or take theirs away from them. And in Book 9 of the Iliad, Phoenix, who is like a second father of Achilles, tells of his own birth, which we can assume is like the telling of the birth of Achilles, or that of Adonis, which I just read about in the Metamorphosis from Ovid. From the Iliad, Book 9. They all held their peace, dismayed at the sternness which he had denied them, till presently the old knight Phoenix, in his great fear for the ships of the Achaeans, burst into tears and said, Noble Achilles, if you are now minded to return, and the fierceness of your anger will do nothing to save the ships from burning, how, my son, can I remain here without you? Your father Peleus bade me go with you when he sent you as a mere lad from Thea to Agamemnon. You knew neither of war nor of the arts whereby men make their mark in council, and he sent me with you to train you in all excellence of speech and action. Therefore, my son, I will not stay here without you. No, not though heaven itself vouchsafe to strip my years from me, and make me young as I was when I first left Hellas, the land of fair woman. I was then flying the anger of Father Amptenor, son of Ormenus, who was furious with me in the matter of his concubine, of whom he was enamored, to the wronging of his wife, my mother. My mother therefore prayed me without ceasing to lie with a woman myself, that so she hate my father, and in the course of time I yielded. But my father soon came to know, and he cursed me bitterly, calling the dread Eurymenes to witness. He prayed that no son of mine might ever sit upon the knees, and the gods Jove of the world below and awful Persephone fulfilled his curse. I took counsel to kill him, but some god stayed my rashness, and bade me think on men's evil tongues, and how I should be branded as the murderer of my father. Nevertheless, I cannot bear to stay in my father's house with him so bitter against me. My cousins and clansmen came about me, and pressed me sorely to remain. Many a sheep and many an ox did they slaughter, and many a fat hog did they set down to roast before the fire. Many a jar too did they broach of my father's wine. And this is kind of interesting, that part, because if you read the story of Achilles' birth and childhood and Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, there's a part where Thetis wants to make Achilles immortal. So she tries to burn the mortal part out of him, similar to kind of like Phoenix's monologue here. But it's also like the Homeric hymn to Demeter, where in the poem, a child called Demophon is burned too on the fire to rid him of his mortality. So maybe this is a part of the mummification process, or the ceremony celebrating it. And the mummy is embalmed in this fluid and placed near the flames to dry or something for 9 nights. This 9 nights is also a metaphor for pregnancy and birth, right? The 9 months, and Phoenix climbs out of the walls of maybe a pyramid, and that the mother is like buried in, and the phoenix rises out of the ashes. Or the Egyptian religion, the soul is transmigrated. So reading further, 9 whole nights did they set a guard over me, taking in turns to watch, and they kept the fire always burning, both in the cloister of the outer court and in the inner court at the doors of the room wherein I lay. But when the darkness of the 10th night came, I broke through the closed doors of my room, and climbed the wall of the outer court, after passing quickly and unperceived through the men on the guard and the women servants. I then fled through Hellas till I came to fertile Thea, mother of sheep, and to King Peleus, who made me welcome, treating me as a father treats an only son who will be his heir to all his wealth. He made me rich and set me over much people, establishing me on the borders of Thea, where I was chief ruler over the Lopians.
Well, that brings us to the end of this video, and I hope you enjoyed it and found it informative.
I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast.